Our guest today is someone who has dedicated his life to understanding the complexities of soccer both on and off the field. Jed Davies is a multi-talented soccer coach, author and consultant. His focus isn't just on how to kick a ball into a net, it's about the intricate weave of strategy, psychology and skill that goes into making great soccer players and even greater soccer teams. According to his bio on X.com, he's passionate about player and playing style development. And we're about to find out just how deep that passion runs. Welcome to the show. In this first chapter, Jed talks about his early career moments. He speaks about standout moments from his early coaching days that influenced his coaching style.
I think with most coaches, there's normally a standout team that you watch as a fan. So for me, that team was Barcelona of 2011. The team with Messi, Xavi, Busquets, Iniesta, Dani Alves, Piqué. Like you remember, you go through that team, you remember that team. It was the team that played the Champions League final against Man United. And I think that with all great teams tend to play through their best players. And what struck me about that team is how the four players got on the ball more often than others. So Iniesta on the left, Xavi had a bit of a free role, Busquets holding, and Messi was a false nine at the time. So I think my interest was all about how do I develop those players, because clearly the best players in that style were all about, they weren't, I don't know if they were the best players, but the most rounded players, and being able to play through those players was always a starting point I had in my mind of how I wanted to play football, or how I wanted football to be played, and I wanted to watch that football. And I think that developing those players obviously doesn't happen by chance. Barcelona have recruited Messi, and they have had a very calculated approach to developing those four players. So my interest initially was just about that Barcelona team. It wasn't even about Spanish football. It was about how did Barcelona do what they did. And that that interest took me, that was more of a passion at the beginning. It took me to meet John Collins, who was Oxford University's head coach. It had me meeting with Chris Davis, who at the time was working for Brendan Rodgers at Swansea, and had me watching Swansea more than I would have liked to have as a Cardiff fan. Same sort of period. I think Rodgers was at Swansea, was it 2009, 2011, something like that. He became Liverpool coach in 2012. So that whole period, and I remember there was a player at Oxford University, and he came up to me, and we weren't, I think I did the best job I possibly could have done at the time. But the biggest compliment I got off one of our players was, your passion is infectious. Like we all buy into it. And I think that I learned it was the player's game, and you have to chase that vision. So, with all that coming together, my first influences and early moments that influenced my style were the Barcelona team, Brendan Rodgers, and then there's different people I was meeting who have a vexed interest in developing individuals. But it was James Nash, who was at MK Dons, Tim Lees, who was at Wigan doing an amazing job and then went to Liverpool, and Louis Lancaster at the time I think was at Watford when we first met. So those people I think taught me the most I could have, it was better than any course I could have taken, was speaking to those people on a daily basis and driving across the country to meet James Nash and spend 6 hours in Starbucks talking about player development.
And how has that evolved then over the years? So, of course, you look at Pep now at Man City, and he does something completely different to what he was doing at Barcelona at the time. I listened to something on TalkSport the other day, and I think it was Simon Jordan was explaining that a team for Pep today looks more like a traditional English kind of 4-4-2 now, with a strong holding striker, with more of an English look to the team, which is obviously completely different to what Barcelona was back then. So how does that translate now to your philosophy? Has that evolved like Pep's has evolved over time?
Not because of what Pep's done, but if I look at what's happened to Pep, he went to Germany, Pep Guardiola, he went to Germany and had to deal with I think he refers to it as the best counter-attack in football he's ever seen in his life, where you lose the ball, you get punished. And then you go to England, where you have arguably the best athletes in the world. And I look at Pep Guardiola when he signed Ederson. I spoke to a coach the other day, a goalkeeper coach who I admire, and he said it killed him when they signed Ederson because he really liked Joe Hart and couldn't understand why he would do that. And if you remember, Joe Hart wasn't doing that poorly for Man City at the time. But now looking back, retrospectively, you're like, well, okay, they put Ederson in goal, who could hurt you from his own goal line and hurt the opposition back four. So now teams couldn't just jump and press. They had to worry about the space behind at all times. And that helps Man City build out the back. And I don't know if Guardiola has done that because of the English game or it's just where he's going. It was like, how do I make the build-up even more efficient? How do I hurt teams from everywhere? And Haaland up front now is another bit. Whereas, if they're going to man mark us, we can go straight into a 9 and play off a 9, which they have done a number of times with Haaland. So I think that for me, I've obviously gone and worked with university players and then I've worked with youth players. I've done analysis for national teams and then working with professional players. And I think at every level it brings a whole different set of challenges. And you always adversity is your best learner. So you're always learning from failure you've made. And I imagine that's a similar process that Guardiola's been through.
In Chapter 2, Jed discusses challenging moments from his career. He begins by sharing a time that his team faced a major challenge and how he guided them to overcome it.
The biggest challenge I've had to deal with most is the lack of volume, variation and variety in games. And I'm talking really about player development, youth player development. Everyone always says, the competition's not good enough. The best need to play the best need to play with the best. And you go to some countries and that just isn't the case. And I know in England, I think that is the case now with E-P. It came in a number of years ago, but it was around getting the best resources, playing against the best resources, the best with the best. And even when it gets to that stage, there's still somebody there that goes, hey, we have to travel to find competition. So I think that's been the biggest challenge. I worked at a club in Ottawa in Canada where we were not on the national team's talented pathway. So what that means is they have a league structure here. It was called Ontario Provincial Development League. Starts at 13. And if you're not in those leagues, then it's very hard to play against those teams because they're quite guarded. Your players can no longer get selected for provincial teams. Well, they can, but then they're told, hey, within 12 months, you need to leave and join an OPDL club. And obviously the players were at our club to be developed. They weren't at our club they didn't believe that at 13 it was about winning, our players. So there was a lot of challenges which came with that. And one of them was, how do we get competition? So we did everything possible. Played games with less players, played in tighter spaces, played up age groups. We had a 03 team at the age of 16 playing lower league men's football, not even the top flight of men's football in Ottawa, and losing more games than we've ever lost in their lives in that season, the first year. Different grounds. We played a man marking approach one season, the next approach we played zonal, and we just keep giving them different change and trying to make that the challenge. Youngest ages, we even give them constraints before they can score goals. We do travel. We played Montreal Impact. It was a 2-hour drive, which is probably the closest team. They're called FC Montreal now. Toronto FC, New York City, New York Red Bulls, and then we came to England and played Arsenal, Fulham, Leicester. We played a number of top teams in I'm forgetting something, Swansea, Bristol City, and we got to play them and in their environments as well. So that gave us a different challenge. But that's been the biggest challenge: is how do we overcome the idea that we don't have enough competition? You can make internal competition, of course, but in terms of the actual games themselves being hard enough that you lose 30% of your games. I think that's the key, is you get 30% of your games can be easy, 30% are going to be matched, and then 30% you're not quite good enough to be on that field, but you're going to compete with them. If you can get that, then you get a lot of things right. So that's been one of the challenges. I think in terms of like a personal challenge, my own personal challenges have been a conscious understanding that I get triggered by people that don't share the same values as me. And that took me a long while to understand why I was angry in a number of situations, or why I would behave in a way that then later I would sit down and go, why I don't agree with what I just did or what I just said. Or if I was just a bit more clear about what my values were and figuring out how to develop a shared value system, I think that would have avoided a lot of problems I've had in the last 10 years of coaching. And some of the solutions I came up with were things like, when someone else does something that represents one of the values that I think are one of the core values I have, then rewarding them and letting them know, catching them doing things well. So that's one. Another might be to outline the expectations every year when you come into a team. and actually looking like what those values look like. So, for example, the values that I currently outline right now are humility, respect, and then commitment to excellence. So when I look at those three things, I think quite often when I've, for lack of better words, lost my head, is because one of those three values hasn't been demonstrated by players, and I assume that's how everyone lives, and it's not. So yeah, I have to do a better job as well at role modeling those things. Role modeling being a humble person and being more committed to excellence in every part of my life, not just football, and then also portraying respect in places. And respect looks different to different people as well. It means eye contact for some people, and in some cultures it means not making eye contact if someone's an authoritative figure. So yeah, just that holistic player development bit, and me being a bit more holistic on what football looks like.
So just going back to what you said then about kind of commitment to excellence, would you say then that you have a really high threshold for a high bar for what you believe kind of for work rate and commitment to the game? So if we look at Roy Keane, for example, I think there's been an interview in the past where he said that he's got such high values and such high expectations that when he was a manager and players didn't live up to that, then that kind of caused issues with him, because he was getting frustrated because it wasn't what he was used to as a player at Man United, being the captain, being a leader as he is. That's the type of thing you're talking about there, then?
Yeah, I think with commitment to excellence, what I'm talking about is having a high performance mindset. Having someone that wakes up every day, and if they don't do something that's making them better, they feel like they've not done something that day. I think it's that never-ending ascension to always want to be better. But I understand that the Roy Keane scenario given, I always wondered if players are like, I've just said I wasn't aware for a number of years that those were the things that triggered me. If players who had been in that Man United locker room were consciously aware this locker room works and the culture works here because of X, Y, Z. Obviously, Roy Keane was a part of that, but it wasn't just Roy Keane. It was Roy Keane, Alex Ferguson, Gary Neville, everyone that was in there, Beckham. And I wonder the bit that Roy Keane brought to that team maybe was balanced off by other players, other head coaches. And ultimately, I know enough about Roy Keane's story and Man United to say it didn't work out in the end. I think Rene Meulensteen and him fell out. Was it him? No, Carlos Queiroz. Carlos Queiroz and Ferguson and Roy Keane didn't share an understanding of how they were going to work together, and it didn't work out. So I have worked under a head coach before who I think struggled with that as well. Like, things were a certain way when he was a player, and they weren't anymore. And the world's changing, as we both know. Just in the last 5 years, the world's changed. So people need to keep updating themselves and keep updating what the world actually looks like for a 15, 16-year-old, if that's what you're working with. And even for, now working the professional game, a 23-year-old now is different to a 23-year-old when I was 23. So, yeah, you just need to keep updating yourself, I think.
And again, going back to something you said previously as well, is about, so developing players, and I'm just going to read you a quote now from the Training Ground Guru. This is an interview then with Ian Evatt, who's the Bolton manager. And he said, I was a centre-back, and it's the most difficult position to develop for these big Category 1 teams. They never have to defend. They're always dominating the ball. They never have to head the ball. We were watching a lone centre-back, and we really liked him. We watched him what must have been about a dozen times in the Premier League too, and no joke, we didn't see him have one contested aerial duel. So are we or are clubs really developing and with the kind of the Premier League too? And I know Brentford scrapped their under-23s a few years ago, and they just have a B team, don't they? And they get players in for that. So are players really being developed for first team football in the Premier League and then lower down the level as well?
I think I see two things. One is, I can't remember who said it, but someone was talking about the Italian strikers of the late 90s, where you had such a long list of world-class players. And also at the same time, a long list of world-class centre-backs. And then in what someone asked the footballer, what's changed, or coach, what's changed in Italian football? We said, well, all we do now is produce midfielders. So there's this idea, I think there's this utopian idea that when you develop good football, more touches of the ball, more possession, we develop better players. And I do believe in that. I think that what's missing is that gap, minding the gap between whether it's 17, 18, 19 or 20 to first team football. And I think that changes when winning is all that matters and the pressure's real. And we always talk about it like pre-season is the happiest place in the world at a professional club. And you have to be really careful that you don't slip into informal relationships with players because everyone's happy. It's the best. Everyone's sharing minutes on the field. There's no pressure. And I've been at a club before where pre-season, the goalkeeper played out the back all pre-season. We get to the first game of the year against New York City in the old NASL. And every time it's gone back to the goalkeeper, who's smashed it. And it's just the pressure of really winning does change things. And I think that's what's not missing, but that's the bit that needs understanding, I think, when we're bridging the gap is what does that pressure really look and feel like? And, what does it really mean to win? And sometimes you do experience that in a youth team when you go to a cup competition, because at the end of the day, one of the reasons you would enter a cup competition is to win. And you get to a final and you're playing against a team that are better than you and you find yourself 1-0 up with 10 minutes left. And then most teams change the style at that point. Bunker in, clear everything at all costs. And then they win and celebrate and there's not a defeat to the football soul in that moment because you've won the cup. So I think that one of the ways around that, we talked about the games program a minute ago, is just to make sure that within their development, as they get older, there's more and more patches of cup finals, semi-finals, where winning really does matter and that pressure really does matter. I think that's one of the things that I've tried to make sure that some of my youth players have had over the last 10 years is that we play in front of fans, we play in front of 400 or 500 people, all their friends, all their family, and it's a cup knockout match. So, yeah, I think that's one of the things that maybe, is it Ian Everett you said that?
Yeah, that's right, at Bolton, yeah.
Yeah, and he's obviously... I remember him being a centre-back. He was someone that was good in the air, so I'm sure that he can see what's missing. Mm-hmm. But again, I think the ball starts going in the air a lot more when winning matters for a lot of people.
In Chapter 3, Jed talks about his triumphant moments. He begins by talking about his most memorable victory as a coach.
I think just given the nature of where I've worked and where I've been at, like if I think about my career, for 6 years I worked at a youth team where the mission statement of that club was to produce international, university and professional level players. So in terms of what a victory looks like, it wouldn't have been a single game. It would have been players that then go on to university, professional and university international professional levels. So I think that, you asked me about the biggest victory. I think there's probably 4 examples of players that went on to become professionals against all odds. So one would have been Antoine Coupland, who became the youngest ever Canadian professional player at Ottawa Fury. I don't think he turned 16 yet. I think he was still 15. But what people don't know is 6 months before, he'd been rejected from an MLS academy. And I remember really trying to support him in those 6 months. That was a tough job. So for him to, within 6 months, turn around and step foot in I think it was USL, in a USL game, that was an amazing moment. He's gone on and he got signed by a club in Croatia and he's currently on loan with an MLS team in Vancouver Whitecaps. So Antoine Coupland was a huge victory, I guess, in part of my coaching career as one. And one of the reasons it was a huge victory is he was probably about 5'5" when he made his professional debut. Everyone was saying he's too small, and he was small. He was very small, but he was so explosive. So when you might have lost a bit of weight, but he definitely had strength and explosive power. So it was odd because his strengths, was X factor, was his physicality. It just was in a different way. So Antoine Coupland be one, and the other two, I think, Benedict Florent and Elijah Barr, who both play for Whitecaps now. They got signed in the middle of COVID. I think it was March. I can't remember what year COVID was now, but it was a time where you couldn't play games anymore. You couldn't train. And it had been long enough into COVID that I recognised some of our kids are going to be hurt. Not hurt, but they're going to have their development affected because they're spending a long time not playing football. You can't play football. I'm sure they were going out. Benedict would have been going out with his brother still. But the day that they got signed by Whitecaps was just such I cried. Like, I remember I was so happy for those two lads because the teams that still were playing were the professional youth academies. So, we got 2 of the boys into that environment, and that was a huge win for me because, I look back now that they're both on a great pathway still to play the career and fulfill their dreams that they have. and all those players I just named, they were part of one team. It's that 03, 04, 05 age group. It was all one training group, really, for the most part. Certainly 03, 04, where 8 of them, 8, let me think, more than 8, 9 of them had gone on and had professional careers from one team. And again, not one of them played Team Ontario, not one of them recognised by Canada Soccer. And I would hate to call them late developers, because I just told you Antoine made his debut at 15 in the professional game. But, aged 11, Antoine was on our second team at the club. So in a weird way, he was a late developer, but I guess it depends what lens you've got it set to. But that for me has been the biggest win I've had in my career is that group of players, those 3 age groups, and part of it was having 05s train with 03s, 03s train with 05s, and there were girls in that group as well. I think the single biggest victory I had, I've been involved with, was during COVID. Obviously couldn't work with the team anymore, and I worked with, my bubble consisted of 2 players that I was coaching. I think I had like 3 people it was called a bubble. I don't know if you called it that, but yeah. And one of the players was suffering in terms of, she had a family member that was sick, and I'd been through something similar. And I think that player developed a lot of strength to commit to want to become the best of something, and football happened to be that thing. And that player ended up going on, from the age of 14 being, an okay player in terms of regional, 16 being a player that people were talking about, going, hey, how does she get so good? And I can't take credit at all for it. I was there, but the player drives that whole process. A lot of it was accidental in a way, in terms of how we made that player make the steps to become a better player. And then by the age of 17, 18 is, being called up for national teams and going on to be a trialist at an NWSL club, and then play professionally in the French top division, which, it's the same as they're playing in the Premier League in the men's game. The French top division is one of the best divisions in women's football. So again, just a huge victory to be a part of that journey.
And for all those players you've just spoken about, so what was it that kind of led them to exceed the expectations? Was there like a quality they all had, which is something they had in common?
All very different. I think Antoine had a confidence that was impenetrable. If someone was going to say you're too small to play, or, you can't do this or that, he was going out of his way to make sure he could do it. The challenge I gave him, he didn't love to defend, and I gave him a challenge. I said, hey man, if you can get to 10 games in a row where you can give yourself a 10 out of 10 effort in terms of how well you defended, I will make sure you get an opportunity at a pro club. And I already had something lined up, of course, but he got to game 8, and game 9 wasn't very good. And I remember thinking, well, how much do I stick by this? And in that moment, I told him, right, okay, we're starting again. The kid was devastated, and obviously, I already had this opportunity lined up from the train with Ottawa Fury. So Antoine, that's what I knew drove Antoine, was doubt. Elijah and Benedict they were both very good when they were 8, 9, 10 years old, relatively good, and they were both physically very dominant. Elijah could knuckle ball a ball from 30 yards at the age of 10. And to knuckle ball a ball, you need a lot of strength in your kicking technique. And they both still have that now. So they both shared physical qualities, and both of them actually needed a lot of support around, I don't think either of them would mind me saying, around dealing with, inconsistencies and mistakes. Benny won't mind me saying, Benedict used to, he'd hit one switch, it'd be great. Everyone would be clapping, or wow, what a ball. And then he'd miss it the next one, and he wouldn't try it again for the rest of the game. So that was who Benedict was. So he needed a different type of support. And then Sadie Sider was the female player I'm talking about, who now was playing professionally last year in the French top division. I talked about it earlier, that high performance mindset where you've developed a passion and a vision for something. So her vision was, I'm going to play for Barcelona. And says it with such conviction that you can't laugh. I think that every morning that individual wakes up, if they don't do something to make them better, they've got a sense of, what do you call it? It's not fear of missing out, but they've missed out that day. They've lost a day. This is a player that had a serious injury to her right foot. I can't remember what the injury was exactly. It was like a bone in the foot. And the doctor said, hey, you can't play for the next 2 or 3 months. And she didn't really report that back to me. She just told me the doctor said she couldn't use her right foot. So for 3 months, I told her she could only use her left foot. If she used her right foot in training or games, it was a free kick. And became two-footed in those 3 months, completely two-footed, to the point now where you hear commentators when she's playing now going, oh, Sadie Sider, what a wonderfully left-footed player. And I'm like, these guys have no idea. But yeah, I mean, that came about from her telling me she couldn't use her right foot. I don't think that was quite what the doctors actually told her.
In Chapter 4, we talk about unexpected moments. Jed begins by talking about off-field incidents that significantly impacted his coaching or team's performance.
Yeah, I think, again, I'd have to talk about COVID again. You had to adapt during that time. You had to find a way to help players get better doing unopposed work for the most part. That was the constraint that was given to us, and doing work at home.
And remind us, what was your job at this point?
I was at Ottawa Futuro, the youth academy, the pro team. But then obviously there was no job during COVID. There was, hey man, like we can't train for the next, I don't know how many months it was. But I still tried to help as many players as I could. And I turned to previous work that I'd seen by Tim Lees and Pepijn Linders, who had spent a lot of their time, or they'd literally developed a technical curriculum for unopposed technical development as part of a wider curriculum. So I used that time because before, I think, my work before that would have been very much around, developing the best decision makers, trying to keep the sessions as rich as possible, so it always looks like the game. And this gave me a sort of a fork in the side, say, hey, you have to work a different way now. You have to support players through unopposed work, through individual development planning, and it added maybe an extra 30-40% onto the way I coach now. So when I look now at how I coach, it's certainly different to before, because I saw the benefits of filming someone's kicking technique and looking at how there was a coach called Bartek, and I can't remember his last name. He worked for Brentford. He was a free kick specialist, and he'd worked with a player called Ryan Williams, who I worked with, who had played for Brentford, that came to Ottawa Fury. So I speak to Ryan Williams a lot to try and get an insight into how Bartek helped him learn how to strike a ball so well. And a lot of it was done through sort of video feedback, filming the kicking techniques, breaking the kicking techniques down into 5 different components, and just wasn't aware of work before. I didn't know I had that interest in me to want to break something down to that degree of detail and actually coach it. So I think that's where COVID, it helped me develop as a coach and give me more structure and more detail, and and also got to fall in love with Bielsa again and look at his training methodology, which is largely technique based, individual based. So that gave me a real push in the right direction for. I always thought of myself as an individual development coach, but really did push me in that direction of how can I actually make every individual better with everything considered, not just the game itself.
Okay. And going back to what you just mentioned then about the 5 different components then about striking the ball, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, the 5 being the way you approach the ball, your run up, how your foot plants next to the ball, the way your foot makes contact with the ball. If it's a knocker ball, it's a slightly different contact. The way your swing is through the ball. So it's just like breaking it down. And when you film something and you slow-mo it down and you want a repeated technique, you really do get that detail out. So the top spin free kick, which is a free kick that Juninho, I can't remember his last name, the one to play for Lyon, he'd mastered over the years, is a really hard technique to get by, and you have to break it down into that sort of components.
Chapter 5 focuses on lessons learned. I asked Jed if there was a decision or strategy that he'd used in his coaching career that he would change if given the chance.
Not that I would change. I think when I look back on things I've learned and lessons that I've taken now do differently, I think the biggest one is connecting with each player differently. As I said a second ago, pre-season in a professional team is an interesting time of your year with a player because everyone's happy. And then as you get to the season where only 11 players are selected for game day, 3 are probably happy to be on the bench, 5 are really unhappy about being on the bench. There's probably even someone in the first 11 that's unhappy about the role they're being asked to play. And then there's maybe another 6 players who weren't even selected for the bench. And misery finds misery, and if you wanted to focus in certain areas, you could be in quite a dark place at that point of being a coach, because you're surrounded by people who are unhappy. I think that what I would change is, and I've taken this from a coach called Dan Machucci, I would always try and connect with an individual before looking to correct a behavior. And Dan has this expression, which is connect before correct. And I think that pro players, man, they have like insecurities around not looking good in front of people. They don't share your values. Some of them don't, and they're brilliant because they don't. As I said earlier, there was different meanings for respect. In some cultures, eye contact is a sign, and others it's not. There's different reasons why people play. Some players really do play for financial gain, which isn't something that I've necessarily had in my worldview of why you play football. You never know what a person's going through if you're not having conversations with them. Footballers, I think human beings, but especially footballers and coaches, are normally poor communicators of how they feel, and they show it rather than tell you, and they're not able to express it, or they haven't got a space to show that they're unhappy, so they express it through a lack of effort or express it through a lack of respect. And just the nature of a locker room, like I said, misery finds misery. So I think what I would change is I'd have that all-encompassing idea of what you're navigating and what you're putting. The first time I went to Ottawa Fury, pre-season was the happiest time. I became everyone's friend. Players, and there was never a reason to have a bad conversation with a player. And then as the season comes around, I quickly realised I put myself in situations with players where I didn't have a professional boundary. So I think that's what I have changed and what I would change going back. And I was 27 when I first started coaching pros, which I wasn't ready. I certainly wasn't ready just from a human perspective. But again, that bit, when it comes to disciplining a player or player not playing or trying to set a cultural boundary in place, it can be so hard to rebuild trust once you've lost it. So I think I'd be much more calculated around how I would deliver those boundaries as a professional coach with professional players.
And then if we look at, in the professional game then in the UK and in England with Chelsea, for example, looking at Graham Potter last season and then Lampard taking over with this big squad of maybe 30 plus professional players, with everything you've just described there, are they almost set up for a fail? Like Poch now, they've really trimmed that squad down now, haven't they? But was Potter kind of set up to fail then, really, with that massive squad? How could he have managed everything you've spoken of? How could he have managed that?
I really don't know. I look at that challenge.
Yeah.
I already think there's a challenge. In the Canadian Premier League, you sign, I think, 23 players under contract, get roster spots. And there already is a challenge throughout the year to make sure everyone feels valued, to make sure that everyone has their own development plan. The players that are older that don't think they're developing anymore, they give them the respect of, they've got a responsibility to behave a certain way, but maybe they don't want to hear how they can improve every 2 minutes. I really don't know how I would manage a squad of 35 unless there's like a reserve team element to that and people accept that they're not part of the first team. Because like I said, it's already with 23 players and you take 18, there's 5 not selected, and this is assuming no injuries. It's an impossible, and I don't know how many injuries Chelsea had at that time. And injuries itself is an interesting challenge because I've seen a coach before, and I won't name who it was, but a player came into a locker room before and he was crying and he said, "Hey man, like you haven't acknowledged me for 4 months," and the player had been injured. And it was a moment for me, and this wasn't someone, everyone cries, but I wouldn't associate this person with crying. And it really struck me. It was like, wow, that if I ever become a head coach or I can take this moment back, I would make sure that I had a connection with that player over the last 4 months because they've been coming in earlier and seeing the physio and staying longer. It was just the culture it used to be is you're the first one and the last one out when you're injured. So I really don't know how Graham Potter did, and I think certainly makes your job harder.
Definitely. And is there an example specifically you could think of where there's an instance where a mistake turned into a learning experience for you as a coach?
Yeah. With this, I could name my first day at Ottawa Fury, and I've already touched on it. My first day at Ottawa Fury, the head coach has gone to me, hey man, make sure you drive intensity in the rondos as you get out. What I didn't realize is the rondos at Ottawa Fury, if I'd have just spent a week observing training first, I would have realized that that was a social moment for them. It wasn't a learning opportunity or a competition element, or it was a social, we've just got out on the field, we want to do the rondos together. And the head coach had a different idea, and the head coach wanted me to drive intensity. So I'm there firing balls in, telling players to be quicker, like press, press. And one of the more senior players turned around and went, who is this guy? Like, what are you doing? And I hadn't connected with the player yet. That player, I don't think ever really regained any sort of relationship with that player. And I knew that player for 2 more years. And I, looking back, he was older than me as well, the player. And I think he saw me as this young new coach who'd barely been introduced to him, telling him to press more in a rondo, which was a social exercise. It was the player's space. It wasn't and I just didn't know that. And I think that being really eager to want to jump in and be a coach was a huge mistake.
So knowing what you know now, what you've just explained, how would you, if you could go back and do that again, what would you do differently then?
As I said, I think I would have I would have stood my ground a bit more with the head coach. I wasn't to know though. The head coach was the one that had been there for a number of years and set the culture. So I'm there. But I think going back, I would have stood my ground and said, hey, I'm going to spend the first week. Yeah, for sure, I'm going to set boundaries in place and become a professional coach, but seeing how things are before I even think to make any sort of change. I might have asked for video footage of training sessions before I got there, which I don't think I did. I think I did a lot of research on the players in games, but I didn't ask to see the training methodology before. That might have been another solution.
In Chapter 6, Jed discusses influential figures. He talks about his relationship and mentorship with Dan Machici.
I think, do you know what? I think the biggest person I have right now as a mentor, and has been a mentor for the last 5 years, is Dan Machici. And I think that what I've learned from him is to be highly process driven. Everything has a process. Nothing is, and not just like, not everything is designed. That's the wrong thing to say, because a lot of things you go into with a sense of curiosity and openness, and you're willing to let it go a certain way. But everything has a process developed to it. So you're not left in the wind to see which way the wind takes you. You have an overall plan and an idea. I think when I look at Dan, as a coach, I think he's highly creative. I think he's extremely passionate. I think he loves his family. I think that he's someone that's extremely empathetic, has an unbelievable amount of energy, and like me, shares that passion to want to achieve excellence, whatever that looks like. And I think what I've taken from Dan is just looking at the way he works, looking at how he presents his work, because what I do with Dan now is I'll meet with him regularly and we'll do presentations together, and we'll look at what he's doing at work and what challenges he's having, and he'll listen to me and what challenges I'm having. And, he's not afraid to text me the word no 6 times if I posted something on social media and it doesn't come across as humble. He's like, hey man, don't self-promote. And it's not been my intention, but I can see how it's looked like that. And he's the guy that will tell me. So I really appreciate having Dan as part of my coach development. And again, it's not something you can pay for on a course. Yeah. So yeah, I just think overall, like, having a 5-year mentorship, I guess, I think Dan would consider that, given the fact he's texting me. But I think that agreement we have, where I help him where I can, he helps me where he can, is really rewarding.
So you just kind of fell into that relationship rather than approaching him and going, will you please be my mentor?
So we had James Nash. So I met James Nash, as I said. He was the MK Dons coach, and he was working with the U14 age group at MK Dons. And Dan Machici at the time was like an untouchable youth coach at MK Dons. I couldn't meet with him. It wasn't something I could get introduced to. Nashi was the one who introduced me to Ottawa Futura because he'd been out. So my interest with Dan Machici continued because I was in an environment where we'd always talk about what MK Dons did. How MK Dons developed players on smaller fields and their own individual development plans, and what they did for Dele Alli to make sure he retained his creativity and his development. And then finally we got Dan Machici out to Futura. So that's how I met him. He became my assistant in a game against Montreal Impact. And he was great. He'd do things like, he'd walk into our summer camps and be like, hey, this club's about creativity, right? I'd be like, yeah. He goes, so why have you got kids sat down in straight lines? And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, well, they could be in groups we had these blackboards around the room with the blackboards and chalk in their hands, doing activities, being creative, and you've got them sat down in a straight line waiting for you to make sure everyone's there. I'm like, okay, bang on. Like, there's one thing. And then he'd go to every detail. Creativity had to be a string across every part of what you were doing. So yeah, I'm really fortunate to have come across paths with Dan when I did. But it was more or less structured. Like, it was a path that we were coming together eventually because I'd studied his work so much and taken such an interest in what he'd been doing.
Chapter 7 is about crowning moments. Jed describes the moment that he felt he had achieved significant success as a coach.
I think the first thing that comes to mind, I'm obviously with Halifax Wanderers now in the Canadian Premier League, and our first 8 games of the season, we didn't win. It's the longest stretch of professional games I've been involved with where we've not won a game. A lot of them were away from home, and we have the craziest travel schedule in world football. And we just couldn't buy a win. We'd outpossess teams, we'd get the build-up right. And we had like Aidan Daniels, who's a player that plays attacking mid for us, is more of a classic number 10. Doesn't really want to run in behind, but will create everything for your team. Will come and collect the ball, get turn, beat players, beat pressure. He enjoys receiving the ball with a player on his back because he knows he can solve that pressure. So I think that one of the things that I did in the lead up to that game 9, which was a big game, I don't want to think about it, but I imagine you get to 12 games without a win, there's conversations starting to happen in professional clubs. And I think we're a team that sell out our stadium every game. You get 100% attendance in our stadium. The city loves the football club. You go downtown and I'm being asked to sign autographs as a coach, and I don't have the courage to say, hey, I'm not a player. I'm sure they know, but I'll just sign it and have give a good chat to them. And you're in a hotel or you're coming back from Calgary on a plane and there's people coming back to Halifax and they're Halifax fans and their kids come up to you. So it's a real football culture, the city. And when you're not winning and there's 8 games in a row, and every now and again, I know they tell you not to do it, I go check social media to see what the fans were saying, and it wasn't good. So anyway, game 9, lots of pressure. It's probably the most pressure I put myself under. And I had an idea with the head coach. I said, hey, we're not playing the striker right now. His name's Thiago Coimbra. He's 18, 19 years old. He'd had inconsistent performances, technically, in terms of receiving the ball and making things happen. But he had unlimited energy with pressing. Run all day. He's one of those people, you meet them every now and again, that just seem to not run out of batteries when they're sprinting. And I said, hey, I've got a vision for how we can use Thiago Coimbra. And that vision happened to be Patrick Bamford as a role model, as someone that used to run in behind and constantly press and be good in the air. And the head coach said, go on then, you've got this week, you're just coaching him the whole week. You don't do anyone else, you coach him. Every session, you stood by him, and he joked and said you was 3 yards away from him at any moment. But I was able to develop a development plan with Thiago, show him video clips of Patrick Bamford, and we looked at his start position and then the way he makes runs in behind and how he opens up space for the 10s that played underneath him. We looked at how Edison Cavani used to attack across, how Mario Gomez would attack the box. And then game 9, I can't remember if it was this game or not, but game 9, I don't know, I can't remember if he got team of the week this week or not, but game 9 was the starting point. We won that game. There's a goal we score, a chance we have where the goalkeeper makes a save, where he's made 12 runs in the space of the possession, and he keeps taking the back line back, and we end up in the edge of the box. He was instrumental in the win that day, and he got in the team, he stayed in the team, he got team of the week twice, he scored goals, and the fans love Thiago Coimbra for the same reasons I love him. You know, he shares all the same values we spoke about earlier. He's humble, he's hardworking, he is highly respectful as an individual, always wants feedback, and just a wonderful footballer to work with. And he turned the season round, and I would say that the feeling I had that week working with Thiago, I believed we were going to win it, and I believed that Thiago was going to be the reason we were going to win it. And that for me was the most rewarding, or do you call it a crowning moment? It was the crowning moment recently I think I've had. And yeah, just preparing him for that role in the team and looking at his attributes and characteristics and try and get the best out of him for the team.
So he came into the team then. So he was playing before as
In and out.
yeah.
Yeah, he
Okay.
was in and out. He was maybe getting 20 minutes a game before. And he's also, the league has a requirement that you have to play 2,000 minutes of under 21 minutes.
Okay.
He's an under 21 player. So he was coming in and out, playing 20, 30 minutes a game. And he just wasn't clicking. It wasn't working for him and it wasn't working for the team. And the team wasn't making enough runs in behind. So he was the catalyst for the change.
And after so many losses, then, and the pressure's building and building and building, you're sticking to the plan. You're altering the plan.
Yeah, I think the build-up got left alone as it was because we were out-possessing teams and dominating games. We have a player called Lorenzo Caligari who used to play for PSG. He's played in Serie A in Italy. Probably the most talented footballer I've ever worked with. And he was making 100 passes a game in some games with a 100% pass completion rate and not the safe types of passes, the types of passes where he splits 3 lines and hits the 9's feet. But our 10s weren't running in behind. And I'm looking at our 10s and I'm like, that's not who they are. They're more 8s. They're more players that want to get involved. So we needed to find a way to get the balance right with stretching the back line back and getting between lines. So it was adding a layer of how can we hurt the opposition back four.
Chapter 8 is entitled Closing Thoughts. Jed shares one piece of advice with aspiring soccer coaches based on his personal experience.
The thing that embodies being a soccer coach, everyone thinks it's about tactics. You come in, everyone has a starting point where we're formations and putting players in positions and a certain rotation you might have an idea of. And I still love that part of the game, and everyone does. But that's not truly what coaching is. When I look at what coaching is, it's developing a culture for the team. Is that saying, I can't remember who said it, was just culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that when I look at that and I look at what culture actually is, and one of the places we got that right was the youth club I worked for in Ottawa. And I think that when I step back and go, how did we do what we did? The first thing we did was everyone had a visible pathway and a vision for where they wanted to go. That statement, everyone wants to be a university professional international footballer. And then within that, you're also seeing other players achieve that who are older than you or the same age. And that one team that I just said produced 9 players, it was not 9 at once. It was 1, then 6 months, then another, then a year, then another. And you would never see the other one coming. It was always, this one's going to make it. So step 1 is a visible pathway. Step 2 is to celebrate more of a holistic player development idea where values are encompassed. We talked about values and behaviors all the time, but do people really put them in place and have ways to measure whether they're in place or not? Dan Matisse has been a great influence on that because I think he does a great job at that. Then step 3 is a sense of belonging. Again, it seems like it's a soft topic and everyone does it, but truly, is there a sense of belonging at your club, or is it just a team thing? Is it like our team's the best team at the club? Because a sense of belonging is different. A sense of belonging is, and there's an expression like if you put these players in different colour jerseys, you still know they played for us. And that was always what we did. And the sense of belonging was, when I look at how you develop a sense of belonging, it's small things like physical contact with the player. You shake their hand, a fist bump, eye contact for me, is one of the things when they come in and in some way saying, I'm really happy you've turned up today. Whether that is like, John, you've turned up, and I'm like, John, and we're celebrating your arrival as you walk to the field. It doesn't have to be the words, I'm glad you're here. It's just a way to express that. And then some sort of ritualistic behaviours, whether it's a handshake, a slogan your team has, a motto. I think James Kerr, who wrote the book Legacy, calls it ritualise to actualise. And I think that those 4 things come together, and that's developing a culture that just keeps on going. And I look at what we did at Futuro. The kids would do classroom sessions, and above the TV in the classroom was Carmen Marin's jersey, who played for Costa Rica. She was the first player that went to an international team from the club. So every day for 10 years, people had been coming and sitting there and looking at Carmen Marin's number 16 jersey. Then we made this big poster with all these players that have gone, and that's all over the place. They see Noah Batne, who went to Lazio and Roma. They see Sadie Side, Eric Lajeunesse, all these players that have gone on to play professionally. There's that. And then there's things like, it's snowing. The field's covered in snow. Well, okay, we can cancel training, or we can text everyone and say, bring a shovel. And we've done that many times. And there's 80 kids on the field shoveling their own field. And then we have the best time playing after. And then the last one that comes to mind is over Christmas just gone before I left. And I knew I was leaving the club and I hadn't told anyone yet. Normally at Christmas, there's an opportunity to go away, recharge. And I thought, this is the last time I'm going to see some of these people. So it was an opportunity for me to, you've coached at a club for 7 years. You've built long-term relationships. For me to have 3v3 tournaments with all the kids who have been here 5 years ago that are still here today. And the first one I think we had 12 people turn out. We had 4 3v3 teams in this indoor facility because in Ottawa it's snowing, you can't be outdoors. And the amount of texts I got saying, hey man, why am I not invited? From kids that are now 23, 24 years old. And then by the last day of Christmas, we had, I don't know how many teams we had. We had like 16 players plus subs. Just got care, and we were filming it, making the whole academy vote who was going to win, which age group was the best. And I think all of that together, everything I've just said, along with the games program, along with the training methodology, along with engaging players in whatever idea of football you have, that's more important than tactics. And that's the bit that, if I was going to leave a closing thought that most people skip and aren't interested in really when they become a coach, but it's the most important part.
So then coming then to kind of one piece of advice you would share with aspiring soccer coaches then, would you say it's kind of forming those connections then with players?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, that connect before correct bit is a really healthy starting point, whether it's professional players, youth players, with a club, you're a coach coming into a new team, maybe don't scream at them in the rondos. I would say that would be a really useful piece of advice for someone starting a new position as a coach.
I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our incredible guest today, Jed Davies. Jed, your insights into soccer coaching, play development and club culture have been enlightening to say the least. I know our audience, whether they're aspiring soccer players, coaches or just fans of the game, will have gained a lot hearing from your perspective. If you want to dive even deeper, be sure to check out Jed's work and resources on x.com. You'll find the links to Jed's social media in the show notes.